They barred me at the door, so I launched a ruthless counterattack at the altar, serving an ultimatum that made powerful people tremble in silence. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, slipped through my mail slot like a knife between ribs. Cream-colored paper, gold-embossed lettering, the kind of expensive stationery that screamed money I'd never had. But it wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, delivered to the wrong house by mistake. I should have walked it over immediately, should have knocked on her door and handed it back with an apology. Instead, I stood in my kitchen, holding an invitation to my own son's wedding, reading my name in the list of people explicitly not invited. Daniel Richard Morrison cordially invites you to witness his marriage to Miss Sophia Catherine Wells. The pleasure of your company is requested on Saturday, the 15th of June, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Brookhaven Country Club, 1247 Meadowbrook Lane. Below the elegant script, in smaller print that most people would miss, a line that made my blood run cold. This is a private celebration. Attendance is by invitation only. Uninvited guests will be removed by security. Uninvited guests, that's what I was to my own son, an uninvited guest. I read those words 3 times before the paper started shaking in my hands. 34 years of raising him, of working double shifts to pay for his college, of being there for every scraped knee and broken heart, and I was uninvited to the most important day of his life. But here's what Daniel didn't know about his old man. Here's what he'd forgotten during those 5 years of barely speaking to me. Those 5 years of choosing his fiancée's demands over his father's feelings. I wasn't just some broken-down construction worker he could discard when I became inconvenient. I was Robert Morrison, the man who'd built Morrison Contracting from nothing, who'd negotiated million-dollar deals with developers who thought they could intimidate me. And I had connections he'd never even dreamed of. My phone was in my hand before I'd finished reading the invitation. The number I dialed belonged to someone Daniel had met exactly once at a Christmas dinner 3 years ago. Someone he'd dismissed as just another one of Dad's boring work friends. James Crawford, attorney at law. Harvard-educated, sharp as a blade, and absolutely ruthless when someone tried to play games with people he cared about. He'd been representing my business interests for 15 years, but more than that, he'd become family when my actual family decided I wasn't worth their time. James picked up on the second ring, his voice carrying that familiar tone of professional warmth mixed with genuine concern. "Robert, good to hear from you. How are things?" "I need a favor, James, a big one." There was a pause, the kind lawyers use when they're calculating risk and opportunity in equal measure. "What kind of favor are we talking about?" I looked down at the invitation again, at my son's name printed in gold letters above words that excluded me from his happiness. "The kind that might get interesting. Can you meet me for lunch today?" "My calendar's clear at noon, the usual place." "Perfect. And James, you might want to bring your briefcase. We're going to discuss family law." After I hung up, I sat in my empty kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion since Martha passed 2 years ago. The morning light streamed through windows she'd loved, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories I could never quite catch. This house held 34 years of raising Daniel. His first steps across these hardwood floors I'd installed myself. His high school graduation party in the backyard I'd landscaped by hand. Christmas mornings when he'd race down the stairs, back when I was still Dad instead of an embarrassment to be managed and eventually discarded. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It started when he met Sophia during his final year at law school, a woman who came from the kind of old money family that viewed people like me as hired help with delusions of equality. Her father owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Her mother's idea of roughing it was staying at a 4-star hotel instead of 5-star. And somehow, my son, who'd grown up in this modest 3-bedroom house, who'd learned the value of hard work by spending summers on construction sites, had convinced himself that he belonged in their world, that his father, with his calloused hands and practical clothes, was something to be ashamed of. The first sign came during Daniel's graduation dinner. I'd suggested we celebrate at Romano's, the Italian place where we'd marked every milestone since he was 12. Sophia had laughed, actually laughed, and said something about wanting somewhere more sophisticated. We ended up at some pretentious steakhouse where the servers looked at me like I'd wandered in from a construction site, which, to be fair, I had. The second sign was the engagement party I wasn't told about until after it happened. Daniel called me the next morning, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're delivering bad news they hope you won't react to. "Sorry, Dad. It was just immediate family and a few close friends. Very small. Very small. Except for the photos Sophia posted on social media showing 50 people in the Wells family's mansion. Champagne glasses raised in celebration of a future that apparently didn't include me." The third sign was the gradual reduction in phone calls, the shortened visits, the way Daniel started responding to my questions about wedding planning with vague non-answers and quick subject changes. I'd ask about venues, and he'd mention work stress. I'd ask about dates, and he'd talk about the weather. I should have seen it coming. Should have recognized the pattern of a young man choosing his new family over the one that raised him. But hope is a stubborn thing, especially when it comes to your children. I kept believing that blood was thicker than social climbing, that 34 years of love couldn't be erased by 2 years of embarrassment. I was wrong. The final confirmation came 3 weeks ago when I'd stopped by Daniel's apartment unannounced, something I'd done 100 times before. But this time, Sophia answered the door, her face cycling through surprise, annoyance, and barely concealed hostility in the space of 5 seconds. "Robert, we weren't expecting you." Not Dad, not Mr. Morrison. Robert, like I was some acquaintance who'd overstayed his welcome. Just wanted to check on Daniel, see how the wedding planning was going. She stepped into the doorway, physically blocking my entry into an apartment I'd helped furnish, whose rent I'd quietly assisted with during Daniel's first year at his law firm when money was tight. "Actually, we're having a planning session with my parents right now. It's probably not the best time." Through the gap beside her, I could see Daniel at his dining table, surrounded by fabric samples and catering menus, deep in conversation with Cynthia and Harrison Wells. 3 generations of privilege deciding how to celebrate love while keeping the father of the groom at arm's length. Daniel looked up, saw me standing there, and for just a moment his expression showed something that might have been shame. But it passed quickly, replaced by the practiced indifference he'd perfected over the past 2 years. "Hey, Dad, yeah, we're kind of in the middle of something. I could come back later, or tomorrow, whatever works." Sophia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "We're actually quite busy with preparations. The wedding is very complicated to organize. I'm sure you understand." I understood perfectly. I understood that my son was marrying into a family that viewed me as an inconvenience to be managed, a rough edge to be smoothed away or hidden entirely. I understood that Daniel had made his choice, and it wasn't me. But understanding and accepting were 2 very different things. Now, sitting in my kitchen with that misdirected invitation in my hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not hurt, not disappointment, not even anger. Something colder and more focused. Something that reminded me of the man who'd built a business from nothing, who'd fought for every contract and every dollar, who'd never backed down from a challenge in his life. They thought they could exclude me from my son's wedding because I wasn't sophisticated enough for their tastes. They thought I'd quietly accept being erased from the most important day of Daniel's life because I wouldn't want to cause a scene. They thought wrong. I walked to my home office, the same room where I'd helped Daniel with homework for 12 years, where I'd taught him the value of persistence and planning. The filing cabinets held 30 years of business records, contracts, correspondence, proof of every deal I'd negotiated and every relationship I'd built. More importantly, they held documentation of every penny I'd invested in Daniel's future. College tuition, law school expenses, bar exam fees, the down payment on his apartment, the car I'd bought him when he passed the bar. Not loans, gifts. The kind of financial support that came with no strings attached, except the assumption that family meant something. I pulled out a folder labeled Daniel Education and Support and spread the contents across my desk. Bank statements, canceled checks, receipts, a paper trail of unconditional love that totaled more than most people made in 5 years. Then I opened my laptop and began researching something I'd never thought I'd need to know. Washington state laws regarding parental rights, family obligations, and the legal definition of financial abandonment. What I found was interesting. Very interesting. My phone rang just as I was printing out the 4th article about filial responsibility laws. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won. "Dad?" His voice carried a note I hadn't heard in years. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. "Mrs. Patterson said she got our wedding invitation by mistake. Said she gave it to you." "That's right, she did." A pause. "So you know? I know you're getting married on June 15th. I know it's at Brookhaven Country Club, and I know I'm not invited." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, it's complicated." "Is it?" "Seems pretty simple to me. You're ashamed of your old man. Don't want him embarrassing you in front of your new family." "That's not how it is," but his voice lacked conviction. "Then how is it, Daniel? Explain it to me like I'm too stupid to understand." "Sophia's family, they have certain expectations. The wedding is going to be very formal, very traditional. They've planned everything down to the last detail. And those details don't include your father." Silence. "Daniel, let me ask you something. When you were 8 years old and you broke your arm falling off your bike, who sat with you in the emergency room for 6 hours? Dad, please don't. When you couldn't afford textbooks your sophomore year, who worked overtime for 3 months to make sure you had everything you needed? This isn't about money. When you were struggling with the bar exam, feeling like you weren't smart enough, weren't good enough, who spent every evening for 2 months helping you study, telling you that you could do anything you set your mind to?" His voice cracked slightly. "You did." That's right, I did. Because that's what fathers do for their sons. That's what family means." "I know that. But Sophia's parents, they don't understand our relationship. They think I'm not good enough for their daughter's wedding. And apparently, you agree with them." "That's not true." "Then prove it. Send me an invitation. Better yet, ask me to walk you down the aisle. Make me your best man." The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't, Dad. I'm sorry, but I can't." "Then we have nothing more to discuss." I hung up before he could respond, my hands steadier than they'd been all morning. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something harder. Something that had sustained me through 30 years of building a business, of fighting for respect in a world that judged you by your bank account and your zip code. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I wasn't going to accept being erased from my son's life without a fight. I picked up my phone and dialed James Crawford's number again. "James, it's Robert, about that lunch meeting. Make it 11:30 instead of noon. And James, we're not just discussing family law anymore. What else are we discussing?" I looked at the wedding invitation, at the date that was exactly 3 months and 4 days away. 3 months to plan something that would remind my son exactly who his father was and what he was throwing away. We're discussing war. The restaurant James had chosen was the kind of place where deals were made over handshakes and reputations were built on who you knew. Mahogany paneling, leather banquettes, and the quiet hum of conversations that shaped the city's future. I'd eaten here dozens of times over the years, usually celebrating contracts that would keep my crews busy for months. Today felt different. Today I wasn't here as Robert Morrison the contractor. I was here as Robert Morrison the father, and that man was about to remind everyone why you don't underestimate someone just because they work with their hands instead of pushing papers. James was already waiting when I arrived, his briefcase open beside him, legal pads covered in notes. At 58, he still had the sharp eyes and silver tongue that had made him one of the most feared attorneys in the Pacific Northwest. More importantly, he had the kind of creative mind that found solutions other lawyers wouldn't even consider. "You look like a man with a plan," he said as I settled into the booth across from him. "I'm working on one. Tell me something, James. In your professional opinion, what obligations does a son have to a father who's invested significantly in his future?" James leaned back, his expression shifting into what I'd learned to recognize as his courtroom face. "Legally, very few. Morally, that's a different conversation entirely." He paused, studying my expression. "But I'm guessing you're not interested in moral obligations right now." I pulled out the folder I'd compiled that morning, sliding it across the table. "Daniel's education cost me $237,000. Law school, undergraduate living expenses, bar exam fees, everything. Not loans, gifts." James flipped through the documentation, his eyebrows rising slightly as he absorbed the numbers. "This is substantial. And you have records for all of it. Every penny. Plus another $48,000 in what you might call lifestyle support over the past 3 years. Apartment deposit, furniture, car down payment, emergency funds when his salary wasn't covering expenses. Nearly $300,000 total. James set down the papers and met my eyes. Robert, what exactly are you thinking? I pulled out my phone, showing him the photos I'd taken of Daniel's social media posts over the past 2 years. The expensive restaurants, the designer suits, the vacation photos from places my construction worker's salary had never allowed me to dream of visiting. My son is living a lifestyle that far exceeds what a first-year associate at his law firm could afford. He's driving a BMW, wearing $1,000 suits, taking his fiancée on trips to Europe. Meanwhile, he's too embarrassed by his father to invite him to his wedding. James studied the photos, his legal mind clearly working through the implications. You're thinking about calling in the debt. I'm thinking about a lot of things. Tell me about filial responsibility laws in Washington state. A slow smile spread across James's face, the kind of expression that had terrified opposing counsel for 3 decades. Now that's interesting. Washington does have filial responsibility statutes, though they're rarely enforced. Children can be held financially responsible for their parents' care under certain circumstances. What kind of circumstances? If the parent is indigent and the child has sufficient means to provide support, the key word is sufficient means. If your son is living beyond what his salary should allow, funded by your previous generosity, that could create an interesting legal situation. I leaned forward, feeling pieces of a plan clicking into place. What if I could demonstrate that I'm facing financial hardship as a direct result of supporting his lifestyle? What if I needed assistance and he refused to provide it? James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. In the rhythm I'd learned meant he was calculating angles and possibilities. You'd need to establish actual need, not just theoretical hardship. And you'd need to prove he has the means to help. What if I told you I was considering early retirement due to health concerns? What if the money I'd invested in Daniel's future had compromised my ability to support myself? Are you having health concerns? I thought about the persistent ache in my back, the result of 30 years of lifting and carrying and climbing, the way my knees protested every morning when I got out of bed, the exhaustion that seemed to settle deeper into my bones with each passing year. I'm 62 years old, James. I've been swinging hammers and carrying lumber since I was 18. My body's not what it used to be. That could work. But Robert, you'd be opening a can of worms that might be hard to close. Legal action against your son, even if justified, could permanently damage your relationship. I thought about the phone call that morning, about the careful distance in Daniel's voice when he'd told me he couldn't invite his own father to his wedding. About 34 years of love and sacrifice being dismissed because I wasn't sophisticated enough for his new family. James, what relationship? He's already thrown me away. At least this way, he'll remember why that was a mistake. The waiter appeared, interrupting our conversation with menus and water glasses. We ordered mechanically, both of us too focused on the legal chess game taking shape to care about food. After the waiter left, James pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making notes. If we're going to do this, we need to be strategic. Filing a filial responsibility claim right before his wedding would look vindictive, even if it's legally justified. What do you suggest? We establish the groundwork first. Document your financial situation, get medical opinions about your ability to continue working, create a paper trail that shows legitimate need. Then, if Daniel continues to refuse reasonable requests for support, we have grounds for legal action. I nodded, seeing the wisdom in his approach. How long would that take? 6 to 8 weeks, done properly. We'd want everything bulletproof before we make any moves. 6 to 8 weeks. That would put us right at the beginning of May, just over a month before Daniel's wedding. Perfect timing to remind him that actions have consequences. There's something else, I said, pulling out another document I'd printed that morning. I did some research on Brookhaven Country Club. Turns out they're having some interesting discussions with the city about their water rights and property tax assessments. James glanced at the papers, his expression sharpening. Your company has contracts with the city's public works department. We do. And I have very good relationships with several city council members who've been asking questions about tax-exempt status for private clubs that exclude certain types of people from membership. The implications hung in the air between us. Brookhaven Country Club, like many establishments of its type, had a history of exclusivity that went beyond simple membership fees, the kind of exclusivity that didn't look good under public scrutiny, especially when city officials started asking uncomfortable questions about property tax exemptions. You're thinking about making the venue uncomfortable for them. I'm thinking about making sure they understand that when you exclude people, sometimes those people have more influence than you realize. James was grinning now, the predatory smile of a lawyer who'd found the perfect pressure point. Robert, remind me never to get on your bad side. Too late for Daniel to learn that lesson, but it's not too late for him to remember who his father really is. Our food arrived, but neither of us had much appetite. We were too busy planning what James would later describe as the most creative combination of family law, municipal politics, and social pressure he'd ever orchestrated. One more thing, I said as we prepared to leave. I want you to do some research on the Wells family business interests, real estate, investments, any dealings with city contracts or zoning issues. Looking for leverage? Looking for understanding. If I'm going to war with people who think they're better than me, I want to know exactly what kind of glass houses they're living in. James packed up his briefcase, his movements quick and efficient. I'll have preliminary research done by Friday. The filial responsibility documentation will take longer, but I can start the medical evaluations this week. And the venue situation? Leave that to me. I have lunch scheduled with Councilman Bradley next week anyway. I'm sure your concerns about tax-exempt status for exclusive private clubs will come up in conversation. We shook hands outside the restaurant, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than hurt and disappointment. I felt like myself again, like the man who'd built something from nothing, who'd fought for every contract and every dollar, who'd never let anyone tell him he wasn't good enough. Daniel thought he could erase me from his life because I embarrassed him. Sophia's family thought they could exclude me because I didn't meet their standards of sophistication. They were all about to learn that Robert Morrison didn't disappear quietly. And when you tried to throw him away, he had a tendency to show up exactly where you least expected him, with exactly the kind of backup you never saw coming. The drive home took me past Daniel's apartment building, and for a moment I considered stopping. Considered going up to his door and making one last attempt to reach the boy I'd raised, to find some trace of the son who used to call me his hero. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd chosen social climbing over family loyalty, who'd decided that impressing his fiancée's parents was more important than honoring his father. That man was about to get a very expensive education in the consequences of his choices, and his teacher was going to be someone he'd apparently forgotten how to respect. I drove past the apartment building without stopping. There would be time for father-son conversations later. Right now, I had a war to plan. 3 days after my meeting with James, I was standing in my driveway at 6 a.m, watching Dr. Elizabeth Harper climb out of her Honda Civic with a medical bag and the kind of determined expression that had made her the most respected orthopedic surgeon in the city. Beth and I went back 15 years, to when she'd been a resident and I'd fallen off a scaffold, shattering my left shoulder in 3 places. She'd put me back together with titanium screws and 6 months of physical therapy. But more than that, she'd become the kind of friend who'd answer her phone at 5:30 in the morning when you called asking for a favor. "Robert Morrison," she said, shaking her head as she approached. "When you said you needed a complete physical evaluation for legal purposes, I should have known you were up to something interesting." "Just need an honest assessment of my physical condition, Beth. Nothing more, nothing less." She studied my face with the clinical detachment that had saved hundreds of careers and probably twice as many marriages. "This wouldn't have anything to do with that son of yours, would it?" I'd forgotten how perceptive she was. "What makes you say that?" "Because in 15 years of friendship, you've never asked me to document your medical condition for legal purposes. And because Martha used to worry that Daniel would break your heart someday." Martha. Even 2 years after losing her, hearing her name still hit like a punch to the chest. My wife had seen things about people that I missed, had understood Daniel's weaknesses long before I was willing to acknowledge them. She was right, as usual. Beth nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry, Robert. I know how much that boy meant to you. Still means something to me. That's why we're here." She gestured toward my front door. "Then let's see what 30 years of construction work has done to your body. Fair warning, though, I'm not going to lie in my report just because we're friends. Wouldn't want you to." The next 2 hours were a catalog of damage I'd been ignoring for years. Chronic lower back pain from decades of lifting and carrying. Arthritis in both hands, severe enough that some mornings I could barely make a fist. Bone spurs in my right knee that made climbing ladders an exercise in controlled agony. Hearing loss from years of power tools and machinery, significant enough to require hearing aids within the next 5 years. Beth's examination was thorough and merciless. Range of motion tests that left me gritting my teeth. X-rays that showed wear patterns consistent with a man who'd spent his life using his body as a tool. Blood work that revealed the kind of chronic inflammation that comes from pushing through pain instead of addressing it. "Robert," she said as she packed up her equipment, "you should have come to me years ago. Some of this damage could have been prevented with proper treatment. Couldn't afford to be laid up. Had crews depending on me, contracts to fulfill. And now?" I thought about the conversation I'd had with my foreman yesterday, about gradually transitioning more responsibility to the younger guys, about maybe stepping back from the physical aspects of the job. Plans that had been forming in the back of my mind for months, accelerated now by necessity. Now I'm thinking it might be time to consider retirement, or at least scaling back significantly. Beth made notes on her tablet, her stylus moving with practiced efficiency. "Based on what I've seen today, I'd say that's not just advisable, it's medically necessary. You continue at your current pace, and you're looking at serious complications within the next 2 to 3 years. "What kind of complications?" "Permanent mobility issues, chronic pain that'll require medication management, possible surgery for that knee, definitely surgery for your back if those discs deteriorate any further." She handed me a business card for a physical therapy clinic. "I'm referring you to specialists for comprehensive treatment, but Robert, the most important prescription I can give you is this: slow down. Your body's been telling you to rest for years. It's time to listen." After she left, I sat in my living room with her preliminary notes, seeing my physical condition laid out in clinical terms that made it impossible to ignore. Chronic degenerative joint disease, moderate to severe osteoarthritis, lumbar disc degeneration consistent with occupational overuse. The medical terminology was damning, but more than that, it was honest. I wasn't the same man who'd started swinging hammers at 18. I wasn't even the same man who'd lifted Daniel onto my shoulders when he was 5 years old, teaching him to change light bulbs because he wanted to help Daddy fix things. That afternoon, James called with an update on his research into the Wells family business interests. "Robert, you're going to love this. Harrison Wells doesn't just own commercial real estate. He's been involved in 3 separate city development projects over the past 5 years, all of which required zoning variances and tax incentives." "What kind of projects?" "Mixed-use developments, mostly. The kind that depend on favorable treatment from city planning commissions and tax assessors. The kind that can be very profitable if you know the right people, and very expensive if those people start asking uncomfortable questions." I leaned back in my chair, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. And Brookhaven Country Club? Even better. They've been fighting property tax assessments for 3 years, claiming their status as a private club entitles them to exemptions. The city's been looking for reasons to challenge that status, especially since there have been complaints about their membership policies. What kind of complaints? The kind that suggest they're not as inclusive as their tax-exempt status requires them to be. Turns out there are very specific federal guidelines about discrimination and tax benefits, guidelines that Brookhaven may not be following as carefully as they should. The implications were staggering. If Brookhaven lost its tax exemptions, they'd be looking at massive back payments and penalties. If Harrison Wells's development projects came under scrutiny, his profit margins could evaporate overnight. "James, how quickly could you arrange a meeting with the city's tax assessment office?" "Already done. I'm having coffee with Patricia Morrison from the assessor's office tomorrow morning. Completely coincidental, of course." "Of course. There's one more thing, Robert. I did some digging into Daniel's financial situation. His salary at the law firm is $68,000 a year. Comfortable, but not enough to support the lifestyle he's been displaying on social media. I thought about the BMW, the designer suits, the European vacations. What's your assessment? Either he's got family money backing him up, which seems unlikely given what you've told me about your background, or he's living on credit, expensive credit that's going to come due eventually. Or his fiance's family is subsidizing his lifestyle. That's what I'm thinking, which means Daniel isn't just marrying into money, he's become financially dependent on it. That changes the power dynamic significantly. After I hung up, I walked to my back deck, looking out at the yard Martha had loved, the garden she'd tended for 20 years before cancer took her strength away. The roses were blooming early this year, their scent heavy in the evening air. Martha would have understood what I was doing. She'd always been the strategic one in our marriage, the one who thought 3 moves ahead while I was still processing the current situation. She'd also been the one who'd seen through Daniel's transformation long before I was willing to admit it. He's forgetting who raised him, she'd said during one of his increasingly rare visits, watching our son check his phone instead of engaging in conversation. He's forgetting what family means. I'd defended him then, made excuses about work stress and the pressure of starting a career. But Martha had been right, as she usually was about people's character. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a photo that made my blood pressure spike. Daniel and Sophia at some charity gala, both dressed in formal wear that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The message was from Sophia's Instagram account, which she'd apparently made public. Supporting the arts with my amazing fiancé, so grateful for this beautiful life we're building together. Beautiful life, built on money I'd provided, at events I'd never be invited to, with people who considered me an embarrassment. I scrolled through more photos. Daniel in a tuxedo I'd never seen before. Sophia wearing jewelry that caught the light like captured stars, both of them surrounded by the kind of people who measured worth by bank accounts and zip codes. There were dozens of comments from friends and family members, all congratulating them on their engagement, their success, their bright future. Not one mention of the father who'd made that future possible. But what caught my attention wasn't the luxury or the social climbing. It was the expression on Daniel's face. In every photo, he looked like he was performing rather than living, like he was playing a role that didn't quite fit, wearing a mask that was slowly becoming his real face. I recognized that expression because I'd worn it myself, years ago when I was trying to break into commercial construction contracts. The desperate eagerness to fit in, to prove you belonged in rooms where everyone else was born, with privileges you'd had to fight for. The difference was, I'd never forgotten who I was underneath the performance. I'd never let the desire to impress people convince me to throw away the relationships that actually mattered. Daniel had made a different choice, and now he was about to learn that choices have consequences, especially when you choose social climbing over family loyalty. I forwarded the photos to James with a simple message. Document everything. This is evidence of lifestyle beyond his means. His response came back within minutes. Already on it, this is going to be very useful. The next morning, I drove to Morrison Contracting's main office for the first time in a week. My crew had been handling things without me, which should have been reassuring, but instead felt like another reminder that I was becoming expendable in my own life. My foreman, Tony Castellanos, was waiting in my office with progress reports and a concerned expression that suggested he'd been thinking about our conversation from last week. But boss, you look like hell. When's the last time you got a full night's sleep? Sleep's overrated, Tony. How are the Riverside project timelines looking? He studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd been working construction for 25 years. Timelines are fine. Question is, how are you looking? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a man carrying more weight than his back can handle. Tony had been with me for 8 years, had worked his way up from general laborer to foreman through competence and loyalty. More than that, he'd become the closest thing I had to family since Daniel had decided I was an embarrassment. I'm thinking about some changes, Tony, maybe stepping back from the day-to-day operations. His eyebrows rose. What kind of stepping back? The kind where you'd be running more of the show, the kind where I'd be more of a consultant than a hands-on supervisor. Because of your back? Because of a lot of things. Tony leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. This wouldn't have anything to do with Daniel's wedding situation, would it? I'd forgotten that Tony knew about the invitation incident. My crew had always been protective of me, and news traveled fast in construction circles. Partly, but mostly it's about facing reality. I'm 62 years old, Tony. My body's telling me to slow down, and maybe it's time I listened. And Daniel's telling you to disappear, and maybe it's time you stopped listening to that. The accuracy of his assessment was uncomfortable. It's complicated. No, it's not. Your son's embarrassed by the man who raised him, and instead of fighting for your place in his life, you're thinking about retiring. That's not complicated, boss. That's surrender. Tony's words hit harder than I'd expected because they contained enough truth to sting. But they also missed the larger picture, the strategic planning that was already in motion. What if I told you I wasn't surrendering? What if I told you I was repositioning for a different kind of fight? His expression sharpened with interest. What kind of fight? The kind where I remind everyone exactly who Robert Morrison is and what happens when you underestimate him. A slow grin spread across Tony's face. Now that sounds more like the boss I know. What do you need from me? I need you to be ready to take over operations if I have to step back quickly. I need you to keep the crews running smoothly while I handle some personal business. And I need you to document any conversations we have about my physical limitations and the need for reduced responsibilities. For legal purposes? For justice purposes? Tony nodded, understanding passing between us without the need for further explanation. He'd seen enough workplace politics and family drama over the years to recognize when someone was building a case for something bigger than personal grievances. Consider it done, boss. And Robert, whatever you're planning, Daniel's going to regret the day he decided his old man wasn't good enough for his new life. After Tony left, I sat in my office surrounded by 30 years of business records, contracts, and awards. Photos on the walls showed projects I'd completed, crews I'd managed, relationships I'd built through competence and integrity rather than inherited privilege. This was who I was. Not the embarrassing father Daniel wanted to hide, but a man who'd built something substantial from nothing. A man who'd earned respect through work rather than demanding it through birthright. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. James's name appeared on the screen. Robert, I've got news. Patricia Morrison was very interested in our discussion about tax-exempt status for private clubs. Apparently, Brookhaven's been on their radar for quite some time. What kind of interest? The kind that involves formal audits and public hearings. The kind that gets expensive very quickly for organizations that can't justify their exemptions. Timeline? She's scheduling a preliminary review for next month. Just routine, of course. Nothing to do with any complaints about exclusionary practices. The timing was perfect. A month would put us right in the middle of wedding planning season, when venue availability became critical and last-minute changes became expensive nightmares. What about Harrison Wells's development projects? Even better news there. Councilman Bradley mentioned some concerns about due diligence on zoning variances. Nothing specific, just general questions about whether proper procedures were followed. I could hear the satisfaction in James's voice. He was enjoying this chess game as much as I was, finding creative ways to apply pressure without crossing ethical lines. James, you're earning every penny of your retainer. We're just getting started, Robert. By the time we're finished, your son is going to remember exactly why he should never have underestimated his father. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I called Daniel's apartment, knowing Sophia would probably answer, prepared for the conversation I'd been avoiding. She picked up on the third ring, her voice carrying that familiar note of barely concealed irritation. Robert, this really isn't a good time. It's never a good time, Sophia. That's the problem. A pause, then the sound of footsteps as she presumably moved to a different room. What do you want? I want to have dinner with my son and his fiancée. I want to discuss this wedding situation like adults instead of pretending I don't exist. The wedding situation is already decided, the guest list is finalized, the venue is booked, the invitations are sent. There's nothing to discuss. Her tone was dismissive, the kind of voice people used when talking to service workers or other inconveniences. But underneath the dismissal, I caught something else. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Sophia, let me be very clear about something. I'm not going away quietly. I'm not disappearing from Daniel's life because you find me embarrassing. And I'm not accepting exclusion from the most important day of his life without a fight. Are you threatening us? I'm explaining reality to you. You've made assumptions about who I am and what I'm capable of. Those assumptions are about to prove very expensive. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. What exactly are you saying, Robert? I'm saying that actions have consequences, Sophia. You've chosen to treat me like an embarrassment instead of family. Daniel has chosen to prioritize your approval over his father's feelings. Those choices are going to cost you more than you ever imagined. Is that a threat? It's a promise. And unlike the promises Daniel made about respecting his father, this is one I intend to keep. I hung up before she could respond, my hands steadier than they'd been in weeks. Tomorrow, James would begin filing the paperwork that would make this chess game official. Within days, Daniel would discover that his father wasn't just some broken-down construction worker he could discard when convenient. He was about to learn that Robert Morrison had spent 30 years building relationships, earning respect, and accumulating the kind of influence that money couldn't buy. And when you tried to throw away that kind of man, he had a tendency to show up exactly where you least expected him, with exactly the kind of backup that turned private family disputes into very public reckonings. The war was officially beginning, and Daniel was about to discover that in any conflict, the side with the most to lose wasn't necessarily the side with the most power. Sometimes it was the side that had already lost everything that mattered, and therefore had nothing left to lose. The morning of June 15th dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect wedding day that photographers dream about and mothers-in-law take credit for arranging. I stood in my bathroom at 5:30, adjusting my tie for the fourth time, studying my reflection in the mirror that had witnessed 34 years of preparing for important days in my son's life. Today would be different. Today, I wasn't the proud father getting ready to watch his boy become a man. Today, I was Robert Morrison, businessman, strategist, and uninvited guest with a very expensive legal team. The Navy suit I'd chosen was the same one I'd worn to close my biggest commercial contract 3 years ago. Professional, authoritative, the kind of outfit that commanded respect in boardrooms and courthouses alike. James had insisted on the psychology of appearance. When you're crashing someone's wedding with lawyers in tow, you dress like someone who belongs in the room, not someone who can be dismissed as a disruption. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Team assembled. See you at 1:30. I poured myself a cup of coffee, noting how steady my hands were. 3 months of planning had led to this moment. 3 months of legal preparation, financial documentation, and strategic positioning that would remind everyone at Brookhaven Country Club exactly who they were dealing with. The drive to the venue took me through neighborhoods that told the story of Spokane's social hierarchy. My modest middle-class area gave way to increasingly expensive developments, culminating in the gated community where Brookhaven sat like a monument to exclusivity and inherited privilege. I parked across from the main entrance at exactly 1:15, watching as guests arrived in Mercedes sedans and BMWs, their designer clothes and practiced smiles creating the perfect backdrop for a society wedding. Through my windshield, I could see Daniel greeting arrivals, looking handsome in his tuxedo but somehow smaller than I remembered, diminished by the grandeur surrounding him. Sophia stood beside him in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, every inch the perfect bride marrying into the perfect family. Her parents flanked them like sentries, Harrison Wells in his custom-tailored morning coat, and Cynthia in something that sparkled expensively in the afternoon sun. At 1:28, James's black Mercedes pulled up beside me. Through the tinted windows, I could see the outline of 3 additional figures. Patricia Morrison from the city tax assessor's office, David Chen from the zoning commission, and Elizabeth Harper, whose medical testimony would form the foundation of everything we were about to do. This wasn't just a father crashing his son's wedding. This was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of influence and consequence that would redefine every relationship in that country club. James approached my car window, his expression carrying the focused intensity I'd learned to associate with legal victories. Everyone's briefed and ready. Patricia has the tax exemption documents. David has the zoning variance reviews. Elizabeth has your medical assessment and the filial responsibility filing. And the venue management? Expecting us. Turns out when the city tax assessor requests an immediate meeting about property exemption status, Private clubs become very accommodating very quickly. I looked toward the country club's main entrance, where security guards in discreet black suits were checking invitations with military precision. The same security that was meant to keep uninvited guests like me from disrupting Sophia's perfect day. They have no idea what's coming, do they? James smiled, the predatory expression of a lawyer who'd outmaneuvered opponents with superior resources. Robert, they're about to discover that when you exclude the wrong person from your family celebration, sometimes that person shows up with his own family, the kind that wears badges and carries legal documents. At exactly 1:30, we moved as a coordinated unit toward the main entrance. James led the way, his briefcase containing enough legal ammunition to turn a wedding reception into a very expensive education about consequences. Patricia and David flanked us, their official city credentials transforming our group from party crashers into a legitimate government inspection team. The security guards recognized authority when they saw it, stepping aside as James presented our documentation. Not wedding invitations, but something far more powerful. Official city business that superseded private property rights and exclusive guest lists. Dradur. Gentlemen, James announced to the increasingly nervous security team, we're here to conduct a routine inspection of the premises regarding tax exemption status and zoning compliance. We'll also be serving legal documents to several individuals attending today's event. The head of security, a man whose expensive suit couldn't hide his growing panic, reached for his radio. Sir, this is a private wedding. Perhaps we could schedule this for another time. Patricia Morrison stepped forward, her city credentials gleaming in the afternoon sun. I'm afraid tax assessments don't wait for convenient scheduling. We have reports of activities that may violate the terms of this facility's property tax exemptions. This inspection is mandatory and immediate. Through the main windows, I could see the wedding ceremony was already underway. Daniel and Sophia standing before an elaborate floral arch, surrounded by 200 guests who represented the cream of Spokane's social hierarchy. The perfect moment for an interruption that would be remembered by everyone present. We walked through the main lobby like an advancing army, our footsteps echoing off marble floors that had hosted decades of exclusive celebrations. The country club's management appeared as if summoned by magic, their faces cycling through confusion, alarm, and desperate damage control calculations. Ladies and gentlemen, the club manager stammered, perhaps we could discuss this matter in private. We have members and guests who are about to witness a very educational demonstration about family values and legal consequences, I interrupted, speaking publicly for the first time since entering the building. My name is Robert Morrison. My son is getting married in your ballroom right now, and I wasn't invited because your members decided I wasn't sophisticated enough for their company. The manager's face went pale as he recognized the name. 3 months of James's preliminary legal work had ensured that Brookhaven's leadership was very aware of the Morrison family situation and the potential complications it represented. Mr. Morrison, surely we can resolve this matter without disrupting the ceremony. The ceremony is exactly where we're going to resolve this matter. James produced a thick folder of documents, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years practicing law at the highest levels. We're here to serve legal papers regarding filial responsibility obligations, tax exemption violations, and zoning compliance issues. This is official city business that cannot be postponed for private social events. The sound of wedding music drifted from the ballroom, traditional processional hymns that reminded me of the ceremony I'd imagined attending as father of the groom. Instead, I was about to become something far more memorable. The uninvited guest who taught an entire social gathering about the difference between breeding and character. We moved toward the ballroom doors like a perfectly choreographed legal ballet. Patricia carried documents that could cost Brookhaven hundreds of thousands in back taxes and penalties. David held zoning reviews that could impact Harrison Wells's development projects for years to come. Elizabeth walked beside me, her medical testimony ready to demonstrate exactly why a son's obligations to his father extended far beyond social convenience. The ballroom doors opened to reveal a scene from a fairy tale. 200 guests in formal attire, an elaborate ceremony backdrop, and my son promising to love and honor someone who had systematically excluded his father from their lives. The perfect moment for a reality check that would be discussed in Spokane's social circles for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced in his courtroom voice, cutting through the wedding music like a blade through silk. "We apologize for the interruption, but we're here on official city business that requires immediate attention." The ceremony stopped mid-sentence. Daniel's face went white as he recognized my voice among the group of official-looking individuals who had just invaded his perfect wedding. Sophia's expression cycled through shock, horror, and pure rage in the space of 3 seconds. But it was Harrison Wells's reaction that confirmed everything James had suspected about the Wells family's vulnerability to official scrutiny. The man who had dismissed me as beneath his daughter's social circle suddenly looked like someone calculating the cost of legal complications he hadn't anticipated. "This is outrageous," Cynthia Wells shrieked, her voice carrying across the ballroom like breaking glass. "This is a private family celebration. You have no right to disrupt it." Patricia Morrison stepped forward, her city credentials gleaming under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. "Ma'am, we have every right to conduct official inspections of facilities that claim tax-exempt status, while potentially violating the terms of that exemption. We also have legal documents to serve regarding family financial obligations." I walked toward the altar where my son stood frozen, still holding Sophia's hand but looking like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Every step reminded me of walking him to his first day of school, of teaching him to ride a bicycle, of all the moments when I'd been the most important person in his world. "Hello, Daniel," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the ballroom. "I know I wasn't invited, but I thought you should know that your father isn't the helpless old man you decided I was." Elizabeth Harper moved beside me, her medical credentials and official demeanor adding weight to every word. "Mr. Morrison, we have the documentation you requested regarding your medical condition and your son's financial obligations under Washington state filial responsibility statutes." Daniel's face had gone from white to gray as the implications of legal terms like filial responsibility and financial obligations sank in. Around us, 200 wedding guests were witnessing something unprecedented in Spokane's social history. Not just a wedding crash, but a systematic dismantling of the assumptions that had governed their exclusive little world. "Dad?" Daniel managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" "I'm teaching you about consequences, son. You decided I wasn't good enough for your wedding because your fiancé's family found me embarrassing. You threw away 34 years of love and sacrifice because I didn't meet their standards of sophistication." James stepped forward with the legal documents that represented 3 months of strategic planning. "Daniel Morrison, you're being served with a formal petition regarding your financial obligations to your father under Washington State Revised Code 74.2a. Your father's medical condition and financial circumstances, directly impacted by the $250,000 he invested in your future, create legal obligations that you've refused to acknowledge." The numbers hit the wedding guests like a physical blow. $250,000. The kind of sacrifice that redefined every assumption they'd made about the construction worker who wasn't sophisticated enough for their company. Sophia found her voice first, her wedding day composure cracking like expensive makeup in summer heat. "This is insane. You can't just serve legal papers at someone's wedding. This is harassment." "Actually," David Chen interjected, his zoning commission credentials lending authority to every word, "we're also here to discuss some irregularities in development projects associated with the Wells family business interests. Projects that may have received preferential treatment in violation of city planning procedures." Harrison Wells stepped forward, his face flushing red with the kind of anger that comes from being challenged by people he'd assumed he could dismiss. "This is a vendetta, a pathetic attempt by a bitter old man to disrupt his son's happiness." "No," I said, my voice carrying across the ballroom with 30 years of construction site authority. "This is justice. You people decided I wasn't good enough for your family celebration. You excluded me from the most important day of my son's life because I embarrass you. Now you get to learn what real embarrassment looks like." Patricia Morrison opened her folder, revealing documents that made Harrison's face go pale. "Mr. Wells, we're conducting an immediate review of Brookhaven Country Club's tax-exempt status based on complaints about discriminatory membership practices. We're also investigating several city development projects that may have received improper preferential treatment. The social dynamic in the ballroom was shifting like an earthquake, generations of assumed superiority cracking under the pressure of official scrutiny and legal accountability. The guests who had dismissed me as unworthy of their company were discovering that influence came in forms they hadn't anticipated. Elizabeth Harper addressed the crowd with the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with family medical crises. Ladies and gentlemen, you're witnessing the legal consequences of adult children abandoning their financial and moral obligations to parents who sacrificed everything for their success. This isn't just about one family. This is about what happens when privilege replaces gratitude. Daniel stood at the altar, still in his wedding attire, watching his perfect day transform into a very public education about character and consequences. The son, who had excluded his father to impress his fiancée's family, was learning that some people couldn't be discarded without significant cost. "This ends now," Sophia declared, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Security, remove these people immediately. They're disrupting our wedding." Actually," James replied with the calm authority of someone holding all the winning cards, "this is just beginning. The legal proceedings we're initiating today will continue for months. The city investigations will take even longer, and every step will be a matter of public record, discussed in newspapers and social circles throughout the region." I looked around the ballroom at faces that had assumed they could exclude me without consequence. 200 guests who were witnessing the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. The kind of lesson that would be remembered long after the wedding flowers had wilted. "Daniel," I said, approaching my son one final time, "you threw me away because you were ashamed of who I am. Now everyone in this room knows exactly who you are. Someone who takes $250,000 from his father and then excludes him from his wedding because he's not sophisticated enough for your new family." The silence was absolute. 200 people processing the magnitude of betrayal they'd just witnessed. A son who had abandoned the father, who'd sacrificed everything for his success. A family that had excluded someone based on social climbing rather than character. James handed Daniel the final set of legal documents, his voice carrying the finality of consequences that couldn't be undone. "These papers outline your father's medical condition, his reduced earning capacity due to health issues directly related to years of physical labor, and your legal obligations under filial responsibility statutes. You have 30 days to respond." As we prepared to leave, I turned back to face the ballroom full of guests who had learned more about family values in 30 minutes than they'd absorbed in decades of privilege. "Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the reception. I hope it's worth what it's going to cost." The walk back through the country club felt different than our entrance. We weren't invading foreign territory anymore. We were leaving behind people who finally understood that actions have consequences and that some individuals couldn't be discarded without significant cost. Outside, in the parking lot where this had all begun, James gathered our team for a final briefing. Phase 1 is complete. Daniel has been served, Harrison Wells is facing city investigations, and Brookhaven Country Club will be fighting for its tax-exempt status. What happens next is up to them, too. I looked back at the building where my son was presumably continuing his wedding ceremony, forever marked by the day his father reminded everyone that respect couldn't be inherited, only earned, and that when you threw away someone who'd earned it over 34 years, sometimes they showed up with their own family. The kind that wore official badges and carried legal documents that changed lives. The war was over. Justice had been served, and Daniel Morrison would spend the rest of his life remembering the day he learned that his father wasn't the embarrassment he'd assumed, but the kind of man who commanded respect from city officials, medical professionals, and attorneys who considered it an honor to fight beside him. Sometimes the best wedding gift you can give your son is a lesson about character, even if he's too proud to appreciate it at the time. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.